You know, there are places that exist on the very edge of things. Not just on the edge of a map, but on the edge of memory, on the edge of progress. They're the forgotten seams of the world, where the new highway bypasses the old road and leaves a little pocket of time to slowly fade. The diner they called the Forgotten Crossroads was exactly one of those places. It wasn't a name on a sign. The sign itself had long ago surrendered its letters to rust and wind, leaving just a flickering neon outline of a coffee cup. No, the name was something the locals had given it, the truckers and the factory guys who were its lifeblood. It was a fitting name. It stood right on the border of the industrial outskirts, that gray, undefined zone where the city finally gives up, where the pavement cracks and splinters, and the weeds push through with a stubborn, relentless life. The air inside had a weight to it. You felt it the moment you pushed open the heavy glass door with its grimy handle. It was a thick, motionless atmosphere, a cocktail of smells that told the story of the place better than any words could. There was the sharp, sour tang of spilled beer, a permanent ghost in the floorboards. There was the heavy metallic scent of heated motor oil, carried in on the clothes of the men who spent their days wrestling with engines. And underneath it all, a kind of general, ingrained weariness. It was the smell of sweat and long hours, of dust from 1,000 different roads, of disappointment and quiet endurance. It was the smell of lives lived in the hard spaces. The sound was just as thick. A low, constant hum of voices, men talking about overtime, about engine trouble, about the price of fuel, about wives and kids and the game on the radio last night. But their words never quite rose above the music. From a pair of dusty speakers mounted in the corners, a hoarse, crackling blues tune bled into the room. It was the kind of music that didn't ask you to dance. It just sat with you, a soundtrack for feeling tired and a little bit broken. The light, or what passed for it, came from the weak neon glow of the sign outside, filtering through the dirty windows and casting a sickly pale light on everything. It turned the faces of the truckers and the factory workers into strange, hollowed-out masks, highlighting the lines etched around their eyes and the stubble on their jaws. It was a place frozen in time, a tableau of weary men seeking a moment's refuge before heading back out into the noise or back home to the quiet. And it was into this stagnant, sleeping scene that she walked. Her entrance was not loud, not dramatic in the way of a slamming door or a loud greeting. It was quieter than that, but far more disruptive. It was like dropping a single smooth stone into the still, murky water of a swamp. The ripples started immediately, though most couldn't have said why. She wasn't beautiful, not in the way the calendars on the wall behind the counter depicted women. She wasn't flashy or bright. She was ordinary. A figure in jeans that had been washed so many times they were pale blue, almost white at the knees and thighs. A plaid flannel shirt, the kind you buy for warmth and durability, not for style, buttoned all the way up to the collar. Her hair was pulled back, plain and simple. Nothing about her should have drawn a second glance. And yet, it did. A couple of conversations near the counter faltered and died. Heads turned, not with open curiosity, but with a kind of subtle, subconscious magnetism. The thing that did it, the thing that snagged the attention of the room, was her walk. It wasn't the sway of a woman looking for attention, nor the hurried scuttle of someone who felt out of place. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, an absolute and unshakable inner confidence. It was the walk of someone who owned the ground they stood on, who knew every creak in the floorboards, who was utterly, completely at home in their own skin. She moved through the greasy, heavy air of the diner as if it were the clean, familiar air of her own house. It was a strange and jarring sight in a place built on transience and fatigue. She didn't seem transient, and she didn't seem tired. She seemed anchored. The silence that had begun to spread was shattered by a voice that was used to shattering silences. The voice belonged to a man they called Grom Thunder. It was a name he'd given himself, and no one had ever dared to argue. He was the self-proclaimed king of this little kingdom, the leader of a local motorcycle crew whose members were scattered around a large corner table, laughing too loudly and taking up too much space. Grom was a mountain of a man, built like the industrial machinery he probably worked on during the day. A thick, fiery red beard covered the lower half of his face, and his arms were a canvas of faded amateur tattoos. When he moved, people got out of his way. It was an instinct, like stepping aside for a truck. The crowd of truckers and workers parted before him now, a human sea yielding to the prow of an icebreaker. He planted himself directly in her path, blocking her way to the counter. He was so much bigger than her, it was almost comical. He looked down, a slow, condescending smile spreading across his face. It was a performance, and he was playing to his audience at the corner table. "Lose something, little doll." His voice was a low rumble designed to intimidate, to command the space. His buddies at the table were already grinning, leaning forward in their seats, ready for the punchline, ready for the fun to start. They'd seen this show before. Grom putting someone in their place, reminding everyone who was in charge. The woman stopped. She didn't flinch, didn't look down, didn't seem to notice the wall of muscle in front of her. She simply raised her eyes to meet his. And what he saw in them, what the whole room saw, was not what anyone expected. There was no defiance. There was no fear. There wasn't even anger. There was just a void. A deep, calm, profound emptiness. It was a gaze that had seen so much that it had nothing left to see, nothing left to be surprised by. It was the kind of emptiness that wasn't vacant, but full of things that Grom and his friends couldn't possibly comprehend. It was a look that didn't challenge him, but simply dismissed him, rendered him irrelevant. And it was this quiet, absolute dismissal that infuriated him more than any curse or threat ever could. His smile tightened. His authority had been questioned, not by a shout, but by a silence. His move was fast, born of ego and cheap beer. It was meant to be humiliating, to break her composure and put the fear back in her eyes where it belonged. He lunged forward and grabbed a fistful of her flannel shirt right at the collar and yanked. Hard. The sound in the suddenly quiet room was deafening. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was sharp, and it cut through the air like a razor. The sound of cheap, worn fabric giving way. A sharp, tearing rip. Buttons, old and brittle, popped off and scattered like tiny, frantic insects, clicking against the grimy linoleum floor. The front of her shirt was torn open, exposing her collarbone and the top of her shoulder. The snickering from the corner table choked and died. Every single eye in the diner was now locked on that small patch of exposed skin. The air grew thick and heavy, so dense it felt hard to breathe. Because there, on her skin, was a picture. It wasn't a flower or a name or some drunken piece of flash art. It was a tattoo, the ink faded by years and sun, but the lines still uncompromisingly clear, still brutally precise. An eagle, its wings spread in a posture of silent, powerful authority. In its talons, it clutched the globe, the entire world held in its grasp, and behind the eagle, an anchor. It was not just a tattoo, it was a statement, a brand, the sigil of an elite brotherhood, a mark forged in fire and chaos, a testament to a life that the people in this diner could only imagine through movies and news reports. The silence was no longer just an absence of noise. It was a physical presence, a weight pressing down on everyone. Grom stood frozen, his big hand still clenched in the air where her shirt had been. The sneer had vanished from his face, replaced by a slack-jawed, pale confusion. He took a half-step back, then another, as if he'd touched a live wire, as if he'd seen a ghost rise up from the floor. In the far corner of the diner, a man who everyone just called Sedoy Gray Hair let out a long, slow breath he seemed to have been holding. Sedoy was a fixture, a quiet old man who nursed a single coffee for hours. Rumor had it he'd served, a long time ago, in a war nobody talked about much anymore. He stared at the woman's shoulder, his old eyes seeing more than just a tattoo. He saw a story. "Marine Corps," he whispered. the words barely audible, spoken more to himself than to anyone else. I'll be damned. The woman seemed oblivious to the shockwave she had sent through the room. With a calm, unhurried motion, she pulled the torn edges of her shirt together, covering the tattoo. Her movements were economical, precise. No fuss, no drama. When she finally spoke, her voice was even and cold, cutting through the ringing silence like a surgeon's scalpel. I came here for some quiet, she said, her eyes sweeping the room, not settling on anyone in particular, yet somehow addressing everyone at once. Not for trouble. She paused, a perfectly timed beat of silence that let her words hang in the air. But, she added, her voice dropping just a fraction, if anyone's bored tonight, we can fix that. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The offer, or the threat, was laid bare, and no one was foolish enough to pick it up. They weren't just looking at a woman in a torn shirt anymore. They were looking at something else entirely. In her posture, in the straight, unyielding line of her back, in the steel of her gaze, there was a discipline they couldn't fathom. The men in this room, Grom included, understood a certain kind of strength. The strength of a loud voice, of a heavy fist, of cheap bravado fueled by alcohol. But this was a different order of power. This was a strength that had been tested and tempered not in bar fights, but in crucibles they could scarcely imagine. It was the quiet, terrifying strength of someone who had walked through hell and come out the other side, not unscathed, but whole. She turned her back on Grom, a final, complete dismissal. She walked the last few steps to the counter and slid onto a stool. The bartender, a young man with a perpetually nervous expression, had been polishing the same glass for the last 5 minutes. His hands were shaking slightly. He froze as she sat down, his eyes wide, waiting. "Coffee, please," she said, her voice back to normal, just a customer ordering a drink. "Black." He nearly tripped over his own feet in his haste to comply. He poured the coffee, his hand unsteady, sloshing a little into the saucer. He set it in front of her without a word, without daring to meet her eyes. The spell was broken, but the atmosphere in the forgotten crossroads had been changed forever. The low hum of conversation didn't return. The blues song on the speakers seemed to have faded away. There was only a tense, respectful quiet. A few minutes later, the woman finished her coffee, left a couple of dollars on the counter, and walked out. The door swung shut behind her and she was gone, disappearing back into the night as quietly as she had arrived. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Grom, still pale, still standing in the middle of the floor like a statue, finally managed to force out a few words, his voice a hoarse croak. He was staring at the door she'd just walked through. "Now that," he breathed, "is one tough broad." From his corner, Sadoy slowly shook his head. He took a sip of his cold coffee and spoke, his voice quiet but carrying through the silent room with perfect clarity. "That's not toughness, kid. That's steel," he said, his gaze distant, lost in memory. "The kind of steel that's been tempered in a fire you and I have only ever seen in the movies. The kind that doesn't bend, and it sure as hell doesn't break." And that was how a legend was born at the Forgotten Crossroads. The story would be told and retold for years. It would become part of the mythology of the place, and from that night on, a new unwritten rule settled over the grimy diner. A rule understood by every trucker, every factory worker, every biker who walked through that door. If you saw that tattoo, the eagle and the anchor, it didn't matter who was wearing it. It didn't matter if it was on the bicep of a giant, or on the delicate shoulder of a quiet woman with tired eyes. You weren't looking at a man or a woman. You were looking at a soldier. And a soldier always, always gets respect. Because they have already paid a price for it. A price so high that most people are lucky they never have to understand it.